folks, George here. This time we're going to talk about the rehabilitative or the deterrence theory of punishment. The deterrence or rehabilitative theorists take their cues from utilitarian aspects of ethics, as opposed to, let's say, the retributivists who take their cues from deontological ethics. Yes? So taking cues from the utilitarian theory of ethics, we recall the greatest happiness principle. That is, the greatest happiness or the least pain for all. Yes? So with that in mind, they're going to say that punishment should either rehabilitate the criminal or deter crimes. The first article we're going to read is by Ernst van den Haag, entitled On Deterrence and the Death Penalty. Van den Haag starts by saying, if we focus on rehabilitation and the protection of society as the only reasons for punishment, then of course the death penalty could be ended. After all, the death penalty cannot rehabilitate somebody, nor is it needed for protection. After all, we could keep people in prison forever. However, let's examine the utilitarian argument that capital punishment is useless because it does not deter. That's going to be the key point here, because Van den Haag's conclusion is going to be, indeed, the death penalty does deter crime. So let's examine that utilitarian argument that the death penalty does or doesn't deter. The problem, of course, with the death penalty and that doing justice in general is that mistakes inevitably occur. But with the death penalty, such mistakes are an irrevocable injustice. Can any amount of deterrence justify the possibility of irrevocable injustice? That's the key question for a utilitarian. That's quite interesting, actually. What he's saying is that innocent people die only matters if it doesn't stop more innocent people from dying. Of course, that's the classic utilitarian problem. Well, some people see it as a problem, clearly not Van den Haag. But the classic retort against utilitarianism is that it suggests that we can sacrifice a certain amount of innocent people if it will save even more innocent people in the long run. Now, deterrence isn't about rational thinking. Rather, it's about the likelihood and regularity. So the question is, can the threat of punishment regulate conduct? By the way, Van den Haag admits that sometimes we need to threaten punishment to an excessive degree. His example is controlling traffic. How dangerous is it really? Well, I just got a speeding ticket in a certain part of town, and it cost me $300. Was that excessive for going a little bit over the speed limit? I promise I wasn't going to kill anybody, right? There's nobody on the street. But it's sometimes, according to Van den Haag, appropriate to give excessive speeding tickets in order to control traffic. The greater good is served in this regard. To be sure, Van den Haag acknowledges, not everybody responds to punishment. Whether to increase punishment depends on the importance of the rules in society, the reaction of the group that you're going to punish or impose these rules upon, and the acceptance of the enforcement. Those are all things that have to be weighed by a good utilitarian. We have to weigh, how is the greatest happiness principle served here? Yes, it might deter people. So, for example, there are places in the world where if you chew gum, it is a crime. Okay? Van den Haag's point is, in certain societies, that might be acceptable in utilitarian weighing, in utilitarian calculus, because in certain societies, people wouldn't mind laws against chewing gum. But it seems to me that in New York City, such a law would be revolted against, or something like that. And we wouldn't. We would be made very unhappy by such a law. That's Van den Haag's point, that we have to weigh so many different aspects, not just deterrence, not just rehabilitation, but, of course, the greatest happiness principle. And the greatest happiness principle depends on the happiness of a lot of different factors. Now, here's a counter-argument that Van den Haag recognizes. Crime isn't affected by deterring punishments, but rather crime is affected by things like poverty. Van den Haag is going to say, of course, crime is higher in impoverished areas, right? But that isn't the cause of the crime. That's a mistake. That's a fallacy of reasoning to say the correlation is the cause. After all, more people die in hospitals than die in my home. Is that the cause? Are hospitals therefore the cause of deaths? Of course not. It's just a correlation because people who are about to die go to places like hospitals. Furthermore, regarding the poverty argument, plenty of poor people do not commit crimes. Even more, plenty of rich people do commit crimes. Therefore, this poverty causes crime argument doesn't hold so much water, according to Van den Haag. The bottom line is that people are affected by costs imposed by laws and punishments. So I brought up the chewing gum example. Guess where nobody chews gum? Singapore. Nobody chews gum in Singapore because there are harsh punishments for chewing gum in Singapore. What does that illustrate? That illustrates that people do, in fact, respond and are affected by proposed costs, like punishments. Now, for Van den Haag, the question is not only whether the penalty deters crime, it's also whether it deters more than alternatives. So, why is that so hard? This is Van den Haag's point. We have to recognize that the absence of evidence for deterrence does not mean that it doesn't deter. A constant homicide rate might be the result of unawareness of a law. You'll forgive me, but this is a bit far-fetched aspect of Van den Haag's argument, but we'll move on. In order to favor the death penalty, Van den Haag suggests that we only need to show that it would deter some people. It would influence some people. We don't need to prove that it would influence all people, right? To be sure, Van den Haag recognizes there is a lot of uncertainty when we weigh and calculate deterrence and the effectiveness of deterrence. Now, while the death penalty's irrevocable nature might demand more deterrence, it can't demand more proof. Why not? The proof isn't there. We can't ask people, why didn't you murder today, for example? It's so complicated and hard to determine. I love the example he gives. We don't demand to prove that a 6-year sentence is more deterring than a 3-year sentence. And I think he's right there. I am rather compelled by his reasoning here. The key point for Van den Haag is we might save some future victims from murder. This effect is plausible. Therefore, we have no right to risk the possible future victims of murder for the sake of sparing convicted murderers. Rather, according to Van den Haag, our moral obligation is to risk the possible effectiveness of the death penalty. And we shall risk that, according to Van den Haag. And thus goes Van den Haag's deterrence argument in favor of the death penalty. Next time, we'll discuss an argument by Badeau, who's going to suggest that the deterrence argument in favor of the death penalty doesn't quite hold water. Until next time, bye-bye.